Welcome back to my series on Silicon Valley, where I go through each episode and I respond and react as a startup advisor, an investor, a founder myself. We are on episode number 3 of season 1. Spoiler alert. It's been a hot minute since I did the last one. My apologies for that. Trying to get back on track. But season 1, episode 3, spoilers alert. Be advised. Warn you again, spoilers alert. Silicon Valley's been around for long enough. You've probably already seen it. But if you have not, go watch it. Spoilers alert. In this episode, it is all about articles of incorporation. Before we continue, I want to give a shout out. I watch these episodes using the Social Popcorn app. I'll tell you all about that in a moment. And that's with one of our founders, very own founders, Paul Williams at startups.com. And I can show you, I have it open, right now here. So I use it. I have my notes in here, and it's just a great way. Asynchronous watch parties. But once again, I'm going to explain that after. Let's dive into the episode. So here we have the end of episode 2. What happens is poor Richard gets the check, realizes that he doesn't have a bank account under Pied Piper. And so there's a conflict. Somebody else owns the name, which is this guy, Irrigation System, Pied Piper. And so he goes to negotiate with Pied Piper, makes a deal with him, etc. I can't remember what the negotiation is. All the stuff that a lot of founders don't realize they need to do in terms of what's my name, protecting the name. And that leads to a whole bunch of shenanigans because, as usual in this show, nothing goes right for them. And it's kind of like they're naive and kind of dumb, but they're geniuses at the same time when it comes to tech. But when it comes to running a business, it's not the same way. And that is very common of founders that I find is really great technically, coding, solving a problem. But then when it comes to just basic business, being an entrepreneur, they miss out on all the information needed. But that's okay. That's what we are here for. Communities like us, startups.com, online accelerators. We got all the information. Some of our busiest advisors are lawyers and accountants, and they give all that information. And you got to make sure you have all that taken care of, because you don't want something dumb like a name dispute or something like that to really futz up your name. And there's a big lesson that comes into play here, which I'll explain in a moment. Now we go over to Peter Gregory, and here he is. He's got the entire Burger King menu laid out, and he goes on this thing. So he goes on kind of like this weird genius Asperger's type obsession with Burger King. And I love this story. In fact, I kind of wish this was the main story. What happens is a startup comes and they've been funded by Peter Gregory, the VC, and they say, we need more money. And he keeps talking about sesame seeds. And they're like, what are you talking about? And he asks him, do you eat Burger King? And, all this stuff. And so he tells his assistant, I want you to buy all these burgers. And he just goes into this kind of, he just gets so focused and has tunnel vision on sesame seeds. And so what ends up happening is that Peter Gregory makes a decision to buy into the sesame seed industry or something like that, commodities, because there's a certain weather event that happens and then the cost explodes and he makes a whole bunch of money and then goes in and is able to have the funds to invest in this company. Now, this is so far from the truth, it's not even funny. As a general partner of a fund and, doing this myself, if I went to my LPs, my limited partners who invested money with me for the purpose of startups, my investment thesis, I'm going to talk about this. And I said, I'm going to buy into sesame seeds or a commodity or coffee beans or something like that. They would kill me. Like, I'd be sued, because that's just not the reason they've invested that money. But maybe Peter Gregory invested his own money or something along those lines, which he's perfectly capable of doing. But it's kind of like, it's funny, but it's not realistic whatsoever. But there's a really important lesson when it comes to an investment thesis, which again, I'll talk about. I'm going to wrap all this up together in a moment. But then, so what happens is young Richard here, he gets into this funk about naming his company, and there's a whole bunch of like, just sexual innuendo jokes about the name Pied Piper and the logo. If your mind is in the gutter like mine, I'll let you run away with it. And then they start thinking about, how do we name the company? Now, Richard wants to keep the name Pied Piper, but they go to this naming thing. And there was a time when startups were all about the name. Like, can you come up with like a clever name back in the day? That trend is over, thank God, because it's just some really weird kind of dumb names that were floating out there. It was all about how clever you can make the name. But so they're demonstrating, and we have here the name. And if you look, the name here, I actually like this name. I thought it was a really clever take on what they were trying to do. If you look at this name, Smaller, SMLLR, I thought that was an interesting take on the name. And that was what they did, is they spelt names in really weird ways and they took out letters. But, cute name. But that storyline, not so important these days as it would be back in the day, because I think a lot of people took a stock in clever names. But these days, nah, who cares? You can change your name anyway. You can do all sorts of different things. It's just a pain in the tail. But here Richard is, he's got to figure out another name because Pied Piper is taken by this irrigation system. And so this story continues. Well, we have Erlich Bachman goes in, and this is funny. This kind of goes back to the culture. He says, a name defines a company. It has to be primal, something that you can scream out during intercourse. And there's a lot of sexual innuendo jokes in this. But then Erlich goes and he eats mushrooms, and then he goes on this big, huge thing to figure out the name and all this stuff. And, it kind of speaks to that culture. I remember spending time in the tech sector with other people in tech, and in San Francisco, and oh my goodness, every night, just like nerds, everybody sat around and smoked pot. I was not a big pot fan. Gives me a headache, but everyone sat around. We did trivia, like total nerdy trivia. If you weren't in tech, specifically in my industry, I was in 3D animation, things like that, and you like special effects. And if you weren't in that, you would think, oh my gosh, congratulations, smoking pot, playing these trivia games, congratulations on your lifetime of virginity, is what you'd be thinking. But it just goes to show the culture, so people just get baked and they have all these creative ideas and what have you. Not a big fan, again, of this type of storyline. And you're going to see, I'm not a big fan of the Erlich Bachman character through the whole thing. He represents kind of the underbelly of the startup ecosystem and startup culture. I know lots of guys like Erlich Bachman and not into it, not digging it, but he plays a specific role to kind of point out, kind of jam that culture in your face and make you realize how absurd it is. But anyway, so he goes on this trip and, it's entertaining. But then what happens is they put out this release, and then the guy who did the deal, who owned Pied Piper Irrigation, catches a release and is like, you totally fleeced me. You're worth millions of dollars, and, things like that. And so he shows up at the house, and here he is confronting, and they're all kind of hiding from him. And that is the danger. If you don't secure your names and all this stuff, and you start putting out press, people will take advantage of you or think that you're a cash cow, and they won't give your name. So just something to think about, and be careful on the type of press and different things that you put out there, because say you want help, or if you go out and you're bragging, you got all this funding and what have you, even though you have to use it, with a lot of discipline, people might say, oh, you just secured a $3 million funding round. Now you can spend this amount, and contractors start raising their rates and things like that. So just be careful on how you go out if you've definitely raised some money, or you're sitting on capital. I don't like to talk about all the capital that I'm dealing with and how much dry powder or how much money I have in the bank. What is the lesson here outside of all this stuff? And I alluded it to before, and I'm just going to write it here again. It's all about the investment thesis. Okay. Let me explain what that is from an investor standpoint. And I do this internally as a founder as well. It's what is the thesis that outlines or structures the way that we're approaching investing our money. So when I have a fund and I've got a bunch of money, I have to go to my LPs and I have to say, this is my investment thesis. This is how I'm going to invest. These are the rubrics I'm going to use to evaluate the investment, et cetera. And here's the way that you're going to know how we approve investments. So we're, sitting around having this conversation, and one of my other general partners asked, well, which one should we, put into? Should we, invest and take on as part of our accelerator? And I said, let's go through the rubric that we've created. And we've got a very specific sort of 7-point rubric that we use to decide. And that's our thesis of what's going to make a great investment. Every investor, a solid investor, professional investor, has one. FOMO is not a good reason for investment. For example, people may be hyped. We have a founder, and you're going to see him floating around if you're following my channel. And he got in front of a fund, and his venture is all about the metaverse. Metaverse is hot, it's futuristic, etc. And so they were like really interested. Let's take a look. But in the end, even though it was a really hot thing, and this was a really great startup, they decided to pass because metaverse didn't fully fit into their investment thesis. Because remember, investors have an investment thesis, but if you're a general partner, they are accountable to that investment thesis. And that's where you can get in lots of trouble with your funding. If an investor says no, and it's just not the area that we invest in, you don't take it personally, because there are so many different segments that you could, chop up for your investment thesis. So people just say, we just don't do crypto, or we don't do HR tech, or we just don't do consumer facing apps. Whereas other investors may do fully like 100%, we're in the consumer app space because they're building this portfolio and they're trying to create network effects. So you have to understand the investment thesis. Now, there are investors like Peter Gregory in the show, who's based on Peter Thiel, the guy from PayPal, Palantir, etc. He's got his own investment thesis, and he's got a real fascinating book. I think it's like from, he talks about competition is for losers, and it's like from 100 to 0 or 0 to 100 or something like that. His book, and I read it, and it's all about his investment thesis on competitive barriers and monopolies and all this stuff. He has a very particular investment thesis in how he invests in companies. And if you can line up and your company, your startup aligns to the investor and their investment thesis, well, then you're in really, really good shape, right? But don't take it personally if they say, no, it just doesn't fit in our investment thesis. Now, how does this affect founders? If you're a founder and you're using your own money, you should have your own investment thesis in terms of the startup. I'm making these assumptions, and we're only going to spend our own money if we know we're going to do this and we're going to do that. Don't just willy-nilly your money around. You need to have an investment thesis on what is going to create a return on the money in your startup. What parameters do you need to see before you chunk in that extra $5,000 for that feature, or that $10,000 for inventory, et cetera, et cetera? So have a disciplined, regimented approach, and almost treat yourself like your own investor and have an investment thesis. This is how I do it. And a lot of founders, they tell me, and only investors have investment thesis. I say, what do you think we're doing? We're investing our own money. And if an investor comes in and gives me a chunk of money, I want to treat their money like I'm investing my own money. And that's the care and attention and responsibility that I think a lot of investors really appreciate when you give them this approach. And I like to tell investors, I want to invest the money into our company like it's my money. And I am I'm responsible. I'm a fiduciary, and I have fiduciary responsibilities for your money. And you do, because guess what? They're shareholders, and you have to be accountable for everything that you put out there. So it's all about the investment thesis. That's the theme that I pull out from season 1, episode 3. If you want to keep following me on this journey, I'm going to go watch episode 4. like I said, download Social Popcorn. You can see my notes. You can see all the other notes in there. You can add your own notes. And if you add your notes before I do the video, well, I'm gonna, read some comments and and I'll start to incorporate them. So let's be a community together and let's learn together. That's what we're all about. I appreciate you watching this video. Make sure leave a comment and subscribe for the future updates. I'm doing interviews with other founders, etc. Remember, we are in it to win it together as a community. And don't forget to check out startups.com, where you can get an advisor like me, and you can participate in a community, the online accelerator. It's good times. See you then. See you in the next video.